All right, welcome to our webinar. My name is Daniel Parker, Assistant Director of Special Education, and I'm joined here today with Deb Heiss, Paula Volpiansky, and Tim Borud from the Wisconsin Statewide Parent Educator Initiative. Today's webinar is on the College and Career Ready IEP's 5-step process, and today we'll be discussing Step 4, Aligned Special Education Services. For each of our webinars, we like to begin just mentioning our College and Career Ready IEP 5 beliefs around high expectations, culturally responsive practices, student relationships, family and community engagement, and collective responsibility. For Step 4, aligning IEP services, these 5 beliefs are important all the time, but out of all the steps, all of these have such critical importance as we support our students with IEPs. Believing that every student can grow and learn, making sure that we're meeting their individual needs through culturally responsive practices, building those relationships. I've heard people say you can have the best program in the world, but if students don't feel safe or trust or feel like they have relationships with others, it doesn't work out so well. We know the importance of family and community engagement in supporting our students, and that collective responsibility is critically important. We'll be talking a little bit about that, especially around supplementary aids and services and how everyone can support our students with IEPs. Our 5-step process, again, this is Step 4 webinar. Our other webinars on Step 1, 2, and 3, you can view. These steps are cyclical and they follow each other, with the 5th step, analyze progress, leading right back to understanding achievement.
We're going to turn it over to Deb.
All right, so this is Deb, and as Daniel said, in Step 4 is going to be one of alignment. The IEP team is going to discuss and determine what types of special education services are going to be provided in order to support the student in meeting the IEP goals and addressing the disability-related needs so that the student can ensure access and engagement in curriculum, instruction, and activities. So it's all about, continues to be about, progress towards meeting early learning and general education standards and expectations. So this chart is probably becoming familiar to you. It was created to help clarify the main purposes and linkages between the steps in the 5-step process, as well as to highlight the roles IEP team members play during each step. It's one of my personal favorites because I really like the terms that are used here for IEP team participant roles. This form itself has multiple purposes. It can be used as a training tool when explaining the steps. It could also be a place to take notes as the team is developing or reviewing IEPs. So you can see that in Step 4, we're going to look at alignment. That's the verb that was pointed out in Daniel's slide. So we've talked about Steps 1 through 3, and in Step 4, we're going to be looking at alignment. In Step 5, which you'll see on the bottom, which will be our next webinar, it will be a task of analyzing progress towards goals. Much of the information that we're presenting today is summarized in the Step 4 at a glance document, which is included in your handouts for this session and is also on our website. And this process chart is in both of those same places. So looking at that alignment and being the architect, the IEP team role of being architects to align services to the student's disability-related needs and to support that goal attainment, it's really critical to look backwards at the student's disability-related needs that were identified in Step 2. So we're looking at a linkage between services and the rest of the student's IEP. IEP services, as we said, are intended to help the student access, engage, and make progress in early childhood or grade level standards, curriculum and instruction, activities, and environments. each of the student's disability-related needs must be addressed by at least one service. That said, it's not unusual for a need to be addressed by more than one service. It also means that each IP goal must be aligned with at least one service. And it's also not unusual for an IP goal to be supported by more than one service. So steps to keep in mind as we move forward. Now, these IP services can include 4 different things: supplementary aids and services, specially designed instruction, related services, and program modifications and supports. And I think that these terms are probably quite familiar to all of you, but just to do a quick review of definitions, supplementary aids and services are aids, services, and supports that are provided in general education classes or other education-related settings to enable a student who experiences a disability to be educated with students without disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate. So this category can include things such as assistive technology and specific modifications that are made for a particular student in general education or other settings. And one of the things that you're going to hear us talking about throughout this webinar is that the statements you make should be clear. So for example, as a supplementary aids and service, we would suggest that you don't list things like modified assignments without describing what needs to be modified. So accommodations are one type of supplementary aid and service that the IP team is going to discuss. Specially designed instruction is the second service, and that can mean adapting as appropriate to the needs of a student who's eligible, the content, methodology, or delivery of instruction. It can be provided in any environment, general ed, special ed, in the community, and it's provided to ensure access to the general education curriculum so students can meet the standards. Remember that specially designed instruction must be included in every IEP. If the student does not need specially designed instruction, then there's no need for special education and the student is not eligible. Also, if a disability-related need affects reading, there needs to be at least one goal and service to support that need. Related services, another term that's probably familiar to you, means transportation and other developmental, corrective, and supportive services as are required to assist the student to benefit from special education. This is an IEP team decision. And the fourth one is the one that sometimes gives folks a little bit of difficulty: program modifications and supports for school personnel. While this is not specifically defined in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, like the other services, these are provided on behalf of the student to help the student close that achievement gap. So here is a look at the I-4, and while I'm thinking about it, I just want to put a shout out here that these forms were recently updated, in fact, this month. So for the very latest version of this, please go to our website and you can check that out. And there's also some really helpful guidance. And one nifty feature now is that there's guidance posted right next to each form. So that can help you out a lot. But this gives us a good place to start. And I would like you to notice here when we look at this part, the program summary part of the I-4, the Individualized Education Program, supplementary aids and services is listed first. And it's considered first when aligning special education services. This is intentional. This is not a mistake that was made. But by looking at this first, it's reinforcing the notion of the least restrictive environment that Paula is going to talk about, and the desire to consider education in the general education environment with supports first. For all of the services, you're going to use this form, and after the needs and goals are identified, and this is where the alignment of services is included to begin the program summary. So it is important to wait until steps 1, 2, and 3 are completed. As Daniel was saying, this is a whole process. So don't skip to step 4 and begin the program summary until you've gone through the other steps. Each service that you include here will have the number or numbers of the goals or needs, you can see that highlighted there, that the services is intended to address. This linkage helps to ensure that there's a special education service for each goal that helps the student to make sufficient progress toward the goal, and that each need is supported with services. So Paula's going to talk about some more guidelines.
Hi, everybody. So as Deb already mentioned, the student's unique educational needs drive the IEP team's decision of the services that will be provided for the student. So let's touch on a bit more about how this determination is made and documented in the IEP. We've already now mentioned it. I think this will be the third time. We'll probably say it a few more times, that the IEP must be written in a way that clearly explains what the services are and the amount of time and resources that will be committed for each service. The level of the school district's commitment of resources must be clear to the parent and everyone else who will be involved in developing the IEP, as well as everybody who will be implementing the IEP. When deciding where services are going to be provided, the team must consider the least restrictive environment requirements that are part of federal law. And I'm just going to share this. I know many of you who are out there listening today are very aware of this requirement, but I'm just throwing this up on the slide to remind you. When documenting decisions about services on the form, the IEP team has to discuss and describe the extent of removal from general ed environment, and this is really based on that analysis of least restrictive environment. If you are using the new forms, this is documented in section 4 under student participation, which is after the program summary. I do want to pause one more time before we kind of move on to some of the meat of writing down and making decisions about services. There have recently been 2 important guidance documents that were developed by the Department of Education related to this discussion. And links to both are on the CCR IEP resource page. They are also on the slide here, and they are also on the final slide at the end of the presentation that has our resources. IEP teams should really review these. I would highly recommend that because they're very important to the discussion about linking services to student needs. Basically, to summarize what both of these letters say is both of them define that in order to make free appropriate public education available to every student, the special education services and supports that are in the student's IEP must be designed to enable that individual child to advance appropriately to attaining goals and being involved in making progress in the general education curriculum, or for young children, the early childhood curriculum, early learning curriculum, that are based on the state's content standards for the grade that the student is enrolled. With respect to students whose behavior affects academic achievement, these letters, or the second letter, emphasizes that schools must provide positive behavior supports to students who need them, and those are very critical services. One of the reasons for that is that when supports are not provided, students often are disciplined and removed from instruction. And the goal is really to have students be involved in instruction and not be removed from instruction. this makes a really clear link between academic achievement and functional performance, which is a point that we have been making all along and is really critical to our RDA, which we have spoke about before, our RDA priority of improving reading achievement for students. Let's move on to the guidelines for services now and talk more specifically about them. A lot of these focus more on how the services must be documented, but the important takeaway related to the CCR IEP process is that you have to talk about these elements before you can actually document them. On a related note, this part of the IEP is the subject of a large number of the special education complaints that we receive from the field and has been an issue with compliance in the past. The area of failing to properly document and implement IEP services. It's usual that school districts, it's not that school districts are not providing services, but often what happens is that we find violations because there is confusion about exactly what is meant by the services that are listed in students' IEPs. And so the importance of clearly describing these services, having a conversation so everybody understands the same thing and what they mean, and writing this down on the IEP form is very important. Service statements must be well developed, or we would like them to be well developed. They must include a description appropriate to each service. A well-developed service statement would mean the same thing to everybody who is involved in the process. For example, instead of saying special education resource, which sometimes we see on IEPs, we would want to explain what that meant. Specially designed reading instruction would be more clear than to describing the service. Special ed resource might imply a location rather than exactly what's happening in that location. Special education law says that IEPs must also include a description appropriate to each service, the projected date for beginning, and the anticipated amount, frequency, location, and duration. In other words, the services must answer the following questions. How much of the service will be provided? How often will it be provided? Where will it be provided? And for how long will it be provided? Let's stop and apply what I just went over. This is a little bit of a tricky question. For now, I want you just to focus on the description of the type of service. We'll talk about amount and frequency in a little bit. So look at this slide and review the examples. There's some examples under each of the 4 types of special ed services. How many of these do you think are well developed and appropriate to meeting a student's needs? Think about why you say yes or no, and I'm going to pause to let you think about which ones and count. How many do you think are well developed?
All right, they're trickling down. So our range is from 0 to 12. Interestingly.
Yeah, most are hovering around 5 or 6 as I've been looking through them. So the developers, those of us, thought that the best answer was probably 8. And again, really this is just describing the type of service. I'd be really interested if a few of you or if some of you wrote into the question box the ones that you think were not well developed. But I'll talk about the 4 that we specifically thought were probably not developed. And again, you know, you guys were harder than we were on this. So the first one that is definitely not developed is 1B, assistive technology. Just writing down, even if you have amount and frequency, just saying assistive technology does not clearly describe what that is.
It could be so many things.
Could be so many things.
Yeah.
The second one that we decided is not well developed is 2B, SLD resource. So SLD resource, again, doesn't say what's going on there. Now it does help that in the new forms you'll be able to write the numbers, but again, when at all possible, you should write things in a way that's clear to folks so that they don't have to infer.
So we got a question. Can you define a little more what's well-developed and what's not well-developed?
And again, for this particular thing, type of service, well-developed would mean, and I'm going to use the stranger test, which I know Deb will talk about a little later. If somebody read it, would they probably know what was going to happen? So for example, under 2A, small group reading and fluency instruction, someone would know that if the student was in that service, they would be getting reading fluency instruction in a small group. That's well developed. Sensory breaks, we said that's well developed. Most people would know what sensory breaks were. There would be amounts, frequencies, conditions. There would likely be information in the rest of the IEP to help explain what a sensory break is. Some people may say that's not well developed enough. We would want more, but so that would be an example.
We had a request for 1B, and so assistive technology is so broad. That could be everything from a text-to-speech to using some type of word processing device. Calculators are assistive technology. There's high-tech and low-tech. There's literally millions of things.
And you know, it could be if a student has a large menu of assistive technology devices that are necessary, it would be useful to say, assistive technology including, and you would write down the types of assistive technology the student gets. And it could be, you know, general types. It could be text readers or scrot, you know, again. But that would be how you would make that better or well developed. The next one that we thought was not specific enough was 4A, consultation. Consultation between whom? You know, consultation by itself and for what purpose. So that is not clear. So sometimes we see consultation and it just doesn't help us. And the last one that we thought was not well developed was co-teaching. Co-teaching really is not a special ed service. It is not a support for staff. You know, co-teaching, and we do have additional information on the website about co-teaching and are developing and in the process of finalizing some resources for the field. But basically, co-teaching is a general education service delivery model. You know, it's a way that general ed is provided in the way staff are work together or not. So co-teaching is not a special ed service for a student, and it certainly isn't a support for staff, because the reason we co-teach is not to support staff. We co-teach to have our instruction, regular instruction work for students. So those are the ones we found. Daniel, are there any more debriefing comments or questions about that?
There was a couple comments around sensory breaks, some people feeling that sensory breaks is too broad and that the more of the nature of the sensory break being more adding specificity.
Which would be, yeah, and adding this, and I don't know if you'd want to put it in the specificity. If somebody could write an example, that would be really great as to just the statement. The amount, frequency, conditions are later. This is just about the statement that goes in that first column on the form, which is type of service. So if somebody has an idea of what they would write instead in the type of service around sensory breaks, and Daniel, do we get to keep these comments?
Oh, yeah.
So that would be very helpful for us as we prepare to do more things, because, you know, that's one of those that's kind of on the line for me as far as whether we would say that's a well-developed enough statement. Maybe that would be acceptable and not well-developed. It won't be not compliant. It's not like consultation, which is really unacceptable. So, okay, we're going to move on. And Deb, take it away.
All right. And I'm just going to say I think it's great if people have high standards for this.
Yes.
You know, that's a good thing that everyone is seeking clarity in what they're writing down. So, all right, let's go back to some of the nitty-gritty about what you're going to write down in terms of amount or frequency or conditions. Whenever possible, the IEP should describe services using daily allotments of hours or minutes. If the student has unique needs such that daily allotments are not appropriate, then look at weekly allotments of time. Remember, you're trying to write this in such a way that everybody on the team understands what's happening here. So if it's still not possible to describe the service with clear time allotments, then the IEP must clearly describe the circumstances under which the service will be provided. In other words, as needed is not sufficient. You need to describe the circumstances, and the extent of any removal from instructional time or general education environments must be clear. So, and the location of services in the program summary should be consistent with the statements regarding participation in the general ed environment based on that consideration of least restrictive environment that Paula had reviewed. So, accommodations and supports. Accommodations are practices and procedures that provide equitable access to grade level content. Accommodations are intended to reduce or eliminate, if possible, the effects of a student's disability or level of language acquisition. They do not reduce learning expectations. So in other words, accommodations don't change the content or required skill level of a lesson, activity, or test. So accommodations and IEP supports may be needed to both access and engage in specific academic tasks as well as functional needs of students. And I think sometimes we focus on accommodations for academic tasks and don't necessarily think about accommodations for students' functional needs. As always, accommodations are going to be based on the unique needs of the student with IEP and are going to be designed to support the goals of the IEP. So also think about, as you're considering accommodations, that needed accommodations can increase students' access, involvement, and progress in general education standards, instructions, settings, or activities. They can also help the student to be more independent. They can improve the student's motivation and engagement. And, you know, as we're working on self-determination, they should reflect student choice and input. And also consider about availability of accommodations in higher ed or future employment. And toward that end, the IEP teams may want to reach out to higher ed research staff as well as local employers to see what kind of accommodations are being utilized. It can sometimes be an eye-opener, I think. So the next slide shows some examples of the accommodations for academic or early learning accommodations and also functional skill accommodations. And obviously there are thousands of possible IEP accommodations, but this slide reminds us of accommodations and supports that can be needed in both of these areas. So again, it should be noted that accommodations should be based on the student's present level of strengths and needs. They should not be based on check boxes that are included on IEP forms, list of accommodations that are found online, or a list of accommodations made available to all students. Only include supplementary aids and services that must be provided to address the student's individual needs. A provision in, there we go, a provision in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act established the National Instructional Materials Accessibility Standards. And so this is also an important consideration when accommodations are being considered. Students who are blind or visually impaired or who have other print disabilities must receive accessible materials in the appropriate format in a timely manner. And that's defined as, at the same time, all other students receive their print materials. So, but don't despair, because Wisconsin school districts can access such materials for students who are eligible, blind students, visually impaired, and other print disabilities from the National Instructional Materials Access Center, and they can do that by making a request through the Wisconsin Accessible Materials Portal, and there's a link right there on the slide that can take you there if you haven't used this. So, the IEP teams have to ensure that students with IEPs who need instructional materials in accessible formats but who are not included under these definitions can also receive materials in a timely manner. So, and this relates back to step 2 when the IEP team would have already considered the student's instructional needs in terms of specialized formats.
We included that slide because we know a lot of people don't know about these free resources and some of those requirements. So take a look at that website if you get a chance.
Yep. All right. Get ready. Here's another example. So here is a whole type of service using conditions. So type of service would be comfort break, sensory break, or walk break. And here's an example of how you can write frequency and amount. When the student becomes anxious or overstimulated and is unable to continue accessing or engaging in class activity, or when the student requests a break. And this could occur 3 to 4 times per day, 10 or 15 minutes each, no more than 1 break per class period. Where could this take place? General education classrooms, hallways, library, or gym.
I love that because it tells you for how long the break is, so that it wouldn't be that maybe the student, when given that accommodation, is then out of instruction for a whole day. So it's really good to have a clear beginning and end point. So we want to know, what kind of special education service is this? Here's a quiz. Is that special education service that we just described a supplementary aid-in service, specially designed instruction, program modification and supports for staff, or a related service?
And think about why.
What do you think?
All right.
Pretty good.
Yeah, yeah. So, and why would that be, Paula? Why would this be supplementary aids and services?
Well, this would be a supplementary aided service because the intent of this is to allow the student to participate. Now, I wasn't asked to prepare an answer, so this is off the top of my head, because it would help the student participate in general education. The intent here is to provide supports to the student so to increase their ability to access and engage in the general ed activities. And by providing the students some breaks, the assumption must have been that before we started doing this, the student perhaps was leaving the room more often or not being able to tolerate or participate in general ed.
Excellent. Excellent answer, just as I knew you would provide. So thank you. All right, one more slide with some examples. Got to go forward. Yep, all right. Examples of specially designed instruction this time. So you can see type of service, frequency and amount, location. And please note under type of service some of the description that's there, such as instruction to build reading comprehension strategies. Pre-teach social studies and science vocabulary. There are some specifics that are offered there, and this harkens back to our earlier discussion about description and that stranger test. You want to provide enough detail that all the individuals on the IEP team can understand, have a common understanding of what is happening. Or if a stranger came in and looked at this IEP, would that individual be able to implement it as it was intended? And you know, that's a pretty common situation when a student moves to another school district and the IEP goes along. Someone who did not develop that IEP needs to be able to interpret it and oftentimes implement it, at least until the school district has a chance to take action.
We want to touch base really quick on ways that IEP teams can engage students in step 4 in aligning services. First of all, it's important to make sure you have a system for preparing students to participate in the IEP team meeting. This may involve talking with the student and families to help prepare them for what level of participation and what information will be shared at the IEP meeting that they can reflect on and prepare for and engage in discussions. It's also important to use language the student understands and explain the IEP terminology. You can also ask the student what accommodations or other supports have been most helpful to them. You might, for some students who might have different levels of comfort and participation, or who might have difficulty answering open-ended questions, you could provide the student with a list of supports from the IEP and ask them which of those supports is most helpful to them. When possible, if you can ask why they feel a support service or strategy helps them to learn or support them in accessing, engaging in content environment, you might get some really good feedback. And this also helps build self-determination and students understanding what supports will help them. So as many of those types of supports and accommodations may be available to them in post-secondary education, for example, through a 504 plan. Finally, it's important to provide participation options. Student-led IEPs are a fantastic resource. There are some webinars on the DPI website on self-directed IEPs, and we'll be developing future content in this area. But regardless of students' developmental abilities, communication and language, there's lots of different ways to engage students in IEPs, from them introducing participants, showing pictures or slides of activities that they enjoy, talking about their strengths, talking about what their goals are and their needs, but also talking about what's worked for them in terms of the services they've received in the past.
So, Tim is going to help us think about what families need to know for step 4.
So the first thing families need to know is that understanding IEP language and vocabulary can be very difficult for some families. For example, the terms supplementary aids and services, or accommodations, modifications, and supports can be easily misunderstood and confusing for families. It's also important to consider the use of an interpreter in cases where English is not a first language for families. Secondly, before being able to work as part of the IEP team to align services to goals and disability-related needs, families must first completely understand what those goals and needs are. This should occur naturally if the team has been using the 5-step process as a framework for the IEP team discussion. When a family understands their child's grade level standards and functional expectations, step 1, when they can identify how their child's disability affects academic achievement and functional performance, step 2, and when they can help develop ambitious and achievable goals, in step 3, they will be able to help make decisions about the services and supports that will best meet the needs of their child. Third, for the goal and service link, correspondence between goals and services does not need to be one-to-one. Oftentimes, families have misunderstood that if you have a goal, you have one specific service for it. Not all families are aware that goals and disability-related needs can have multiple services attached to them. Also, families should know that it is okay for one service to address multiple goals or disability-related needs. And fourth, universal design for learning is something that many families may not have heard about. If you refer to universal design for learning within the context of an IEP team meeting, be sure to share with the family some easy-to-understand language regarding universal design for learning and, specifically, the role that universal design for learning plays in improving outcomes for their child. Next, we have some questions to ask families. The first one is, what does the family already do at home to support the student in meeting high expectations? Parents are experts on their child. It's important to take the things that are already successful at home and have a discussion about using them to create supports at school that will yield positive outcomes for the child. A common example of this may be a certain type of exercise or activity within the day that helps to redirect and focus the child. Perhaps a similar exercise or activity could be built into the student's school day to assist the student with focus. The second question is, what aids, services, supports, and accommodations does the family feel have been effective in the past, and why? Keep in mind that the caregivers are the ones who can offer the consistency of a year-to-year view of the child's progression. Often, educators see a child for a school year, and then that child has a different teacher and or paraprofessional the next year. It's important to find out from the family what types of services or supports have been effective in the past, and also what types have not been effective. By continuing to address child-specific best practices, you will improve the outcomes for that child. And the third question is, how can we develop services and supports for your child in such a way that it supports and respects your family's time and traditions? Addressing culturally responsive practices for a child allows the IEP team to create services, supports, and accommodations that are based on a level of comfort for the student, and therefore increases the likelihood of positive outcomes for the child. As an example, there are cases where a student may have difficulty completing school assignments at home. If there are factors related to the child's disability, such as social and emotional needs, trauma, or illness that make it difficult to complete homework assignments, the family may want to request an amount of homework that will allow the child to complete it and have success. By respecting this value of time in the IEP and writing accommodations that meet the specific disability-related needs of the student in the home setting, the child will have more success at home and in school. An example may be an accommodation that states only 20 minutes of cumulative homework to be assigned on a daily basis. In this case, homework can still be a part of the child's day, but it is minimal, and the family has more time to focus their attention on other aspects of the child's disability. Next, we have some tips for engaging families. The first is write service descriptions clearly. This is critical for good communication between IEP team participants and also staff who are responsible for implementing the IEP. In the homework example used in the last slide, if the support was written as, quote, no more than 20 minutes of homework to be given nightly, end quote, each one of the child's teachers may interpret that as they can give up to 20 minutes of homework. For a child in middle or high school, with many teachers, this can add up to a couple hours of homework. By writing the support as up to 20 minutes of cumulative homework may be assigned on a daily basis, the word cumulative clears up any confusion about the amount and also encourages the teachers to collaborate to make sure the support is met. Second, thinking of achievement gaps as opportunity gaps is one way for IEP teams to brainstorm the types of skills, supports, or services that can assist the student to improve access, engagement, and progress in preschool and grade school level curriculum and instruction. Aligning IEP services to teach a student new skills and providing a student with academic, environmental, and socially emotional supports allows them access to all learning opportunities needed to engage in preschool or grade level academic instruction and other activities and demonstrate understanding. Third, discussing possible service options that could address the student's needs is a good way to get reluctant families involved. Most families may not be aware of the different possibilities in terms of services and supports that could be used to address their students' needs. Because of this, they aren't able to help the IEP team make completely informed decisions from their perspective. If the families are fully involved in this discussion and decision-making, they will feel more comfortable and able to share important and meaningful input about the services and supports they think will be most helpful for their child. Fourth, creating a vocabulary guide for families is a good way to inform them without singling them out. Of course, we often use educational jargon or acronyms during IEP meetings. Many families don't know these terms or acronyms. By giving them a copy of these terms and acronyms ahead of time, the family will know what is being talked about and feel more comfortable with sharing during the meeting. And last, remember to use active listening to address concerns and answer questions. It is always important to do this so parents feel acknowledged and respected and help move the team to consensus decisions and mutual understanding.
So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Paula, and she's going to continue on for us.
Thank you, Tim. And you know, it's really important because we talk about in each of the steps how important it is to figure out how to engage families meaningfully in all of them. So I hope all of you are who listen to that are thinking about ways for each step that you would come up with ways to engage families. And something that might be helpful is to just sit and brainstorm some prompts or questions to ask families who may not be volunteering to participate in different parts of the process.
Absolutely.
So the at-a-glance documents, which you have in your handouts, and there's also a link in the CCRIP web page, describes what we would expect to see in practice and what we would hope not to see in practice. And I'm not going to read this to you, but here are some expectations related to step 4. And I'll just summarize a few of them. Again, the reminder that when you look at the services, you should be able to track them back to the needs and the goals that they relate to, and it should be direct and clear and not inferred. The services that students get should not be solely based on impairments or descriptive of a school district's program necessarily. They should be individualized and related to needs. Teams really should discuss whether staff who are working with students may need some sort of information or training demonstration, and I know that happens a lot with related services where it's really important for the staff other than the related service providers to know how to use the support strategies in working with students to generalize things to classroom and other school environments. If staff don't have sufficient knowledge, it's very difficult to properly implement the IEP. Special ed teachers need to work collaboratively. Again, we don't want educators planning in isolation. We really don't want to see goals that are just developed by one person. And the services, we should think about across environments how we're going to implement the services related to the students' needs and goals. And again, a good example with this are often with some of the related service or the needs that relate to those. And I'll give one very quick example about mobility. For example, a student's mobility may affect their access and engagement, and hopefully that discussion occurred during step 2. There may be a goal related to mobility, and hopefully that goal is framed in a way that it relates mobility to the uses in the environment and the applied improvements related to the student's mobility, skills, and generalization. So when you're thinking about services to that, it makes sense that that student may need some direct occupational or physical therapy to address their mobility skills. But it also would make sense that there are supplementary aids and services, supports that every staff member may need to provide to that student so that they generalize those mobility skills related to the effects that we talked about to improve access engagement. And also it's quite likely that there will be program supports and modifications for staff's consultation, demonstration, modeling, and those kinds of things that would occur. So again, we like to think about these things across environments, across staff. And we've talked enough about the writing it specifically and not subjectively, so I'm not going to go there. This is, the at-a-glance documents all include step checks, and we encourage you to use these step checks when you've looked at your documentation of IEP services, as well as to evaluate the discussion that occurred during your meeting. Did you talk about all these things, and are they documented properly? Another thing I'm just going to mention today is UDL, and during our next webinar we will likely have an application activity related to UDL. But these guidelines really should provide some checkpoints for your discussion and provide some exploration, both related to barriers about access during step 2 that you would talk about, but also in relation to step 4, you would want to look at, well, how would we remove barriers that may occur in the environment that the student's disability would magnify the effects of. And what services might reduce or eliminate those barriers? What might support the IEP goals and address the student's disability-related need? We will eventually be developing a module on the relationship between UDL, Universal Design for Learning, and the 5-step process, and there is a link on the resource page to resources around this. So in our culminating activity, this is a matching activity, and what we'd like you to do, and I'm going to do a couple of them. I think I'll pick 2 because we probably don't have time to do all of them. But what we want you to do is look at the need and the goals one at a time, and I'll tell you which ones we're going to look at first. Let's look at N1. The goal is improve phonology and decoding skills. Then look on the right, and in the question box, write down which of the service statements would likely be appropriately linked to that need. And it could be more than one, or just one. Hopefully not none, because there should be something related to every goal and need. Interesting. So there is no specific right or wrong answer for these. There are some preferred answers that are more direct, and again, we like to be explicit. The answers really come from the IEP team understanding of the student's needs and how the services address the need. So the more obviously you know the student, the more you will know which services really are intended to address that. And A and C are our most likely responses that we came up with. Some of you said all of them, and perhaps that could be, but improving phonology and decoding skills, the services specifically that address that are A and C. Let's look at G1. I'm going to lie and do one other one after that. Let's look at G1. Goal 1, increase words read correctly. Which service or services do you think will directly relate to helping the student increase the number of words read correctly, increase their fluency and accuracy? Great. It's interesting. And we had A, but I can also see, some of you said C, and I can also see there is some actual interesting research about using digital text and the effect on reading fluency. So I can see why some people put C for that one as well. Let's do the last one. Let's do N2. Develop and use strategies to reduce frustration, improve ability to independently access text, and engage in activities. So N2. A, B, C, D, or any multiple thereof. Interesting. So as we looked at this, we read this as the need was to both develop skills as well as use strategies. And because of that, we thought that actually all 4 of the services, because they either address developing strategies or using them. And we had a little conversation about why specially designed instruction might improve that. And part of that had to do with the linkage between the student's functional skill issues, which was frustration and anxiety around reading. And some of the discussion was that we believe that if we could improve their reading skill, it also will reduce their anxiety. So that's why we decided. And those of you, we're not going to do G2. I'll tell you the answers, the most likely response answers to that are B and D. So that is where we got that from. Excellent.
And I think that this is probably a good point also to note that, you know, we've been talking about through all the steps how the process is important and the discussion that happens at the IEP team meetings. And the completion of this activity is a really salient example of that. Mm-hmm. You know, it's the conversation that happens and the collective responsibility of all the people on the IEP team meeting and what they bring about their knowledge of that student.
And again, it's also really intentional thinking. We should really intentionally think about how the resources that we are providing are directly addressing needs and goals. These are just a few of the resources that we provide on the DPI site, as well as the OSERS letters. And there's a few bulletins that one of them you actually have attached to your presentation. It's the describing services bulletin, as well as a few others. We put in the one on telespeech and the one that relates to NIMUS on here. There's also a live binder that WISPE has been wonderful at putting together as we've been going through these, and they have resources that would be appropriate and interesting for families connected to all 5 of the steps, and one of them is actually in your handout packet as well that was attached to the webinar.
We wanted to share also with you our College and Career Ready IEP tool. This is a discussion tool. If you go to the College and Career Ready IEP webpage, you can find this discussion tool. And it also, if you click on 5-step process and effective disability, we have discussion starter questions that can also help out with you. All right, well, that ends our questions for today. We want to thank everyone for your participation in these webinars, and there will be a survey. It will really help us if you take time to fill that out. But thank you, and we're going to go ahead and sign off. Take care.